Hello everyone, my name is Nicole Kerr, and today I will be presenting Writing Reader-Centered Feasibility Reports. So basically, a feasibility report is used when determining whether large changes are practical and desirable. Decision makers usually ask consultants and some employees to conduct extensive research, and once this research is done, it is presented in a feasibility report. There are two main features of feasibility reports, and the first is the decision makers consider their alternatives. They tend to ask the same sorts of questions. And the second is feasibility reports are prepared so often in the workplace that a set of conventions have developed concerning their content and organization. This has been proven successful in helping writers provide the information their readers want in a structure that the readers find easy to use. These conventions constitute the superstructure or genre of the feasibility report. As you research, plan, and write feasibility reports, you will be helped immensely by your knowledge of the reader's typical questions and the superstructure for answering them. So the questions that readers ask most often are, why is it important for us to consider these alternatives? In some cases, you need to tell decision makers why they have to make the choice in the first place. The next question is, what are the important features of our alternatives? This is so that they can understand your detailed discussion of the alternatives. Readers want you to highlight the key features of each one. Are your criteria reasonable and appropriate? To help your readers choose between alternative courses of action, you must evaluate the alternatives in terms of specific criteria. Are your facts reliable? Evaluating alternative involves comparing facts about them against the criteria for judging them. Your readers want to know what they can rely on and the accuracy of the facts you present. How do the alternatives stack up against your criteria? The heart of the feasibility study is your evaluation of the alternatives in terms of your criteria. Your readers want to know the results. What overall conclusions do you draw about the alternatives? Based on your detailed evaluation of the alternatives, you will reach general conclusions about the merits of each. And lastly, what do you think we should do? Because of your expertise on the subject, your readers want you to tell what you recommend. So the superstructure for feasibility reports rely on 7 different elements. You have the introduction, which is why it is important for us to consider these alternatives. Overview of alternatives, which means what are the important features of the alternatives. The criteria, which is are your criteria reasonable and appropriate. The method, which is are your facts reliable. Evaluation, which answers how do the alternatives stack up against your criteria. Your conclusion, which is what overall conclusions do you draw about the alternatives, and recommendations, what do you think we should do? So I will be guiding you through the process of preparing feasibility reports. Defining your communications goal. A feasibility report's purpose flows directly from its goal of helping decision-making readers choose between 2 or more courses of action, one of which is usually to continue doing things as they are done now. The report's usefulness goal is to provide an easy-to-use form the information and advice its readers need to make this decision. By identifying the specific way your readers will ask the last 4 questions above. These. The report's persuasive goal is to assume its decision-making readers that it provides a solid basis for decisions they must make. The writer's guide for defining your communications goal will help you identify the additional information about your communications purpose, readers, and context that is needed to fully define its goals. So, conducting research. When you define the goal of your report, you also define the goal of the research. Here are a few additional points that deserve emphasis when you are preparing feasibility reports. Gain a full understanding of your readers' criteria. Begin by researching your readers. Investigate all implications of the alternatives being considered. In particular, consider the actions that would be required to implement the alternatives. Consult several kinds of sources. Different kinds of sources can provide different perspectives and types of information. Avoid bias in your information gathering. Employees conduct feasibility studies sometimes start out favoring a particular alternative. They may then tend to seek out information that supports that choice. Consider creating tables for analyzing the information that you've gathered. Tables or matrices can help you examine the alternatives That way, your readers want to point by point against the criteria, and this approach matches the way your readers will use your report. Planning. When planning a feasibility report, your most important decision is how to organize content between your introduction and your recommendations. Sometimes the most effective way to organize is to create 5 middle sections, one for each of 5 middle elements of the superstructure. This you will see in this layout. A second organization can be more effective for readers who have 2 or more decisions to make. This you can see in this layout. And lastly, a third organization works well when your readers will make a single decision, but you used a different research method for gathering information relevant to each of the criteria. In such cases, readers find it helpful to have a separate chapter or section devoted to each criteria. This you will see in this example. So, drafting and revising. Some people mistakenly think that drafting a report could or should wait until all research has been completed. Although there are more advantages to drafting parts as soon as you are able to. By drafting your criteria as you begin your research, you sharpen your sense of what you need to find. So I will be going over crafting the major elements of feasibility reports. So the introduction. In the introduction to a feasibility report, you should answer your reader's question, why is it important for us to consider these alternatives? The most persuasive way to answer this question is to identify the problem your feasibility report will help your readers solve or the goal it will help them achieve, to reduce the number of rejected parts and to increase productivity and so on. Beyond that, your introduction should announce the alternative courses of action you studied and tell generally how you investigate them. All right, for criteria, there are 2 ways of presenting criteria. Number 1, devote a separate section to identifying and explaining them. And number 2, integrate your presentation of them into other elements of the report. It is very important to present your criteria early. You should introduce it early in your report for 3 good reasons. First, because your readers know that the validity of your conclusion depends on the criteria you use to evaluate the alternatives. They will want the evaluation of the criteria themselves. The second, your discussion of the criteria tells readers a great deal about the scope of your report. Did you restrict yourself to technical questions, for instance, or did you also consider relevant organization issues? And lastly, for presenting your criteria early, is that your discussion of the alternative courses of action will make much more sense to your readers if they know in advance the criteria by which you evaluated the alternatives. Sources of your criteria and common types of criteria. The 4 most common types of criteria are, will this course of action really do what's wanted? Can we implement this course of action? Can we afford it? And is it desirable? Method. By explaining how you obtained your facts, you answer your readers' questions. Are your facts reliable? By showing that you used reliable methods, you assure your readers that your facts form a sound basis for decision making. The source of your facts will depend on the nature of your study, library research, calls to manufacturers, interviews, meetings, and so on. How much detail should you provide about your methods? That depends on your readers and the situation, but in every case, your goal is to say enough to satisfy your readers and that your information is trustworthy. Overview and evaluation of alternatives. To understand your detailed evaluation of the alternatives, your readers must first understand what the alternatives are. Often, you can just give a short explanation, but other times you may need to explain the alternatives in detail. For example, the hospital executives were familiar with what conventional phones could do. They didn't know anything about capabilities of internet telephone systems, such as their ability to forward voicemail messages to an email account of that person called. Consequently, the internet system in detail, highlighting features conventional telephones did not have that could help doctors, nurses, and other hospital personnel. Conclusions and recommendations. Your conclusion constitutes your overall assessment of the feasibility of the alternative courses of action you studied. You might present your conclusion in 2 or 3 places in your report, but you should certainly mention them in the beginning as well as detailed in separate sections following your evaluation of the alternatives. For recommendations, it's customary to end a feasibility report by answering the decision maker's question, "What do you think we should do?" Because you will have investigated and thought about the alternatives so thoroughly, your readers will place special value on your recommendations. Depending on the situation, you might need to take only a single sentence or many pages to present your recommendations. Sometimes your recommendations will pertain directly to the course of action you studied. Do this or don't do this. At other times, you may perform a preliminary feasibility study to determine whether a certain course of action is promising enough to warrant a more thorough investigation. And lastly, I wanted to present a sample report so that you can base off your feasibility reports in the future off of this. So we have the summary, introduction, some tests, some graphs, So more information that will answer readers' questions on why, on the why and the what. And lastly, we have the conclusion and the recommendation. All right, well, I really hope that you enjoyed the Writing Reader-Centered Feasibility Reports. Thank you for listening and have a great day.